So you've bought yourself a bottle of Remus Gatsby Reserve. First, congratulations. It's really, really good. Bottle is gorgeous. Really has that Art Deco Gatsby kind of style. You're going to share this with your friends. There's actually a pretty cool story that you can relate to this bottle. In fact, it's an insane story. Let's take a sip through time. At the age of 6, George Remus and his family immigrated from Germany to America. They eventually ended up in the Chicago area, and George got into the pharmacy business because of his uncle. So he became a pharmacist and eventually became bored, and he decided to become an attorney. And most of his clients were defendants in murder cases. George Remus is the lawyer who first came up with the temporary insanity defense. This is what he was famous for. But in Chicago, he didn't want to have to deal with Al Capone and all of the turf wars that were going on in the 20s. He discovered that with the Prohibition law, you could sell whiskey for medicinal purposes through pharmacies. And being an ex-pharmacist, he figured out, okay, I'm going to leave Chicago, and 80% of all of the distilleries that were doing whiskey at that time were within a 300-mile radius of Cincinnati, Ohio. Buys a whole bunch of pharmacies, buys a whole bunch of distilleries, and so he's selling the whiskey legally, but he's also having his own trucks that are delivering whiskey to his pharmacies stolen, robbed, and he's actually secretly taking the booze and selling it illegally at the same time, which is obviously much more profitable. During his heyday, he had 3,000 employees, and his net worth in the 1920s was around $40 million. dollars. Author of The Great Gatsby was F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald actually met George Remus during this time when he was so extravagant and throwing all of these extravagant parties. George Remus was one, probably not the only influence, but a major influence in the main character of the book. Eventually, the law catches up with George Remus. They find out about what he is doing with his bootlegging business because he's got way too money and he's sloshing it around. Most of the people at these parties are, the judges, the politicians. Pretty much everyone in Cincinnati knew he was a bootlegger. While in prison, he becomes friends with an undercover prohibition agent named Franklin Dodge because the business is still going on. And George tells him that his second wife, which he was currently married to, was running his business for him while he was in jail. Dodge, instead of using this to prosecute the wife, quits his job, goes to the wife, they have an affair, and he moves into the house that George Remus bought for he and his wife. And after she had liquidated pretty much everything except the house, Holmes decided she was going to divorce George and left him $100. While George is still in jail and about to be released, Dodge and Holmes tried to get George deported back to Germany. That didn't work. So then they tried to hire a killer to go and kill George, but the guy doesn't go through with it and tells George all about the plot. So on the morning of the divorce, George is in his car with his driver. He sees Imogene and her daughter from her first marriage get into a taxi. So George has his driver chase down the taxi. So imagine a high speed chase in the 1920s going through Cincinnati. George grabs the wheel from the driver and runs the taxi off the road. This is at a place called Eden Park in Cincinnati. He gets out of the car, she gets out of the car, and he starts chasing her. He chases her down, grabs her wrist hard, pulls her around, holds her close. He pulls out his gun, shoots her in the abdomen. She falls dead. George immediately goes to the police and turns himself in. George is in jail again, this time for murder, so he's on trial. He decides to defend himself because he used to be a defense lawyer. Sure enough, he uses the temporary insanity defense. He's got probably a pretty friendly jury listening to the story of what had happened. In only 19 minutes, the jury comes back and finds him not guilty by reason of insanity. So he spends 7 months in an insane asylum and then he's freed. And at that point, he's decided, okay, I've had enough. I just want to live out the rest of my life. One of the interesting mysteries to the story, no one ever figured out where the money was. Imogene was the only one who knew where the money was, and now she was dead. Interesting fun fact, even though George Remus is called King of the Bootleggers, he never actually drank at all.